Transition. Transition area is one of the most interesting and unique aspects of the sport. Every transition area is different, and it is very much dependent on how much space you have, what equipment you have to mount your bike racks, and the entrance and exits to transition, which always cause an awful lot of trouble. When it's done really well, it can look really amazing and be a centerpiece of the sport. When it's not done so well, it can just look like one big mess. When you are looking at transition area from the point of view of an official, the key things to look out for are that it's clearly defined with a neutral flow. Now, I'll explain what that is in a second. But clearly defined means that there's a separation between the transition area and the rest of the world with barriers or fences. It should not be in an open car park or in a field where spectators or anyone can just walk in. So it needs to be clearly defined. It needs to have clearly defined exits and entrances, and it needs to have a neutral flow. It needs to have suitable racking and support. So a lot of new race organisers sometimes make the mistake of getting racks that are either too long to support the weight of the bikes, or they're unsafe and are very difficult to tether to any form of legs. It's secure. During the race, nobody should be in there, and athletes are not allowed markers. So they can't use talcum powder or balloons or any other identification tools to mark their spot. And this is always a risk when it's a big, huge race with hundreds of participants. So one of the things you'll do as an official is you'll walk around transition area and see if athletes have marked their spot in some way. And all you do in that case is you just remove the balloon, or if it's obvious talcum powder, you kind of clean it up or remove the marker. People need to have their equipment in the allocated area. Now, depending on the level and I suppose the level of event and the level of the athlete, some races will allow you to bring in boxes to put your kit in, others won't. So it's important that if people are bringing kit in, that they're allowed to bring in what they're supposed to bring in, and not the kitchen sink. Generally speaking, it's just race equipment. And transition area should be closed until the race is finished. Now, transition layout and flow. Consider a typical transition area. You have bike racks going from top to bottom, and ideally what you want is a transition area which has a swim in on one corner, a bike out on the opposite corner, a bike in at the same corner as the swim, and the bike out in the same location as the run out is the same location as the bike out. The reason you want this is no one athlete should have a shorter distance during transition than any other. Now, let me show you another example. Not untypical, and it'll be one of many different types of transition areas you'll encounter. So here's our same transition area, except in this case, we have a swim in the top left. Now, ideally you'd like to swim in on the bottom right, but in this case, because it's a car park or because it's a field with gates in this way or whatever, the bike out has to be this way. Bike in comes in the same way, and also not uncommon, because it's convenient and because it's the only way out, the run out is out the same gate or the same entrance or same gap as the bike out. Now, the problem with this is this neutral? No, it's not. And the reason for that is that if you were an athlete who got down to transition area, looked at the flow, what you do is you'd put your bike there, because you'd know you'd have the least to run with your bike, either in T1 or T2. People who come late to the race would probably end up finding themselves there. And this wasn't uncommon a number of years ago when the flow of transition wasn't really a key priority. But you can imagine the amount of extra time an athlete would have to cover just to go back and forth with the bike in that situation. So pause the video and have a think about how you might resolve this flow situation. So, how did you get on? Well, let's have a look. We'll start again. So, remembering the previous slide where we had the flow for the swim and bike in on the bottom left and the swim or the bike and the run out on the top right. Well, what we need to do in a transition area is you try and emulate that flow. So for the swim, you bring them in, but instead of allowing them to go straight to their bike, you run them down the length of transition area and you bring them in on the bottom left. They grab their bike, they go out, bike out as normal, and then you have to deal with the bike in. But likewise, you need to bring the bike and the athlete over to where the swim athletes are coming in, make sure it's safe, they join together, they all run the exact same distance, and they enter transition area in the bottom left. Then you can have the run out as normal. This is really, really important. It may look convoluted and race organisers may not like it when you're trying to explain it to them, but it's extremely important for the fairness of the sport, and it's should be unequivocal when it comes to major competitions and championships. So the transition area is a place that you are most likely to interact with the athletes quite a bit. During check-in, before the race, during the race, in relation to mount, dismount and athletes transitioning and other behaviour. The general transition rules are: a competitor must mount and dismount the bike at the respective designated mount and dismount zones. These should be clearly marked. A competitor must at all times rack his or her bike only at their designated bike rack position. A competitor must at all times place their equipment at their bike rack location. A competitor must not interfere with another competitor's equipment. A competitor must not run bare-chested. They need to be fully clothed insofar as they have their tri-suit on. They can't run with no top on. And as you'll have seen earlier, they need to have it zipped up to the sternum. A competitor must have their number displayed forward. Now this is something you'll see athletes having a problem with a lot. Race belts are a nightmare, and sometimes numbers get crumpled up, torn, and depending on the quality of the events, this can be very much a advisory piece of advice you give to athletes, asking them to stop and to switch their number around or to go back and get a number. But with some of the more competitive athletes, they're likely to ignore you and keep running on, which is DSQ. So everybody must display their number forward on the run. In the bike check, the purpose of the TO is to provide another set of eyes to competitors as they enter transition. We're not there to check the safety of the bike in detail. It's purely a superficial inspection, checking that there are no obvious missing components. Now, depending on the quality of the event, if it's a championship event, you won't really see any strange bikes coming in, but in amateur events, you probably will. But you'll have people coming in sometimes with only one brake, or with things missing off their bike, or with even a child seat and things like that. These are unsafe, and it's your job just to have a quick glance to see if you notice anything that you think is unsafe about the bike. Check for the existence of handlebar and plugs. Inspection of the competitor's helmet. Athletes need to wear the helmet coming in to transition area. They can't have it just lying on top of their head on their bike, and you'll spend a lot of your time telling people to clip their bike helmet on. Mount dismount line. During the race, this is where officials spend a lot of time because it's a key area for penalties, but it's also a very busy, potentially dangerous area of the race, with athletes flying in off the bike and other later waves coming out. And especially when you've got mixed ability waves or races, you might have people who are not really sure of what they're doing and how they're doing it, and then you have those who are trying to weave in and out and go really super fast. So you'll find that this area becomes quite busy, and often an afterthought from a safety perspective. Really, this area should be as controlled as transition area with plenty of barriers and tape to keep spectators off the course. Because it's generally where people like to stand to get to see people coming in and out of the race, out of the transition area. So it's a popular place to stand. Any athletes, obviously, who don't observe these requirements can get a yellow card. Safety checks. It is not the responsibility of the TO to check the safety of the bike's roadworthiness. You'll often see that this being done at races, and it isn't actually correct. We're not there to check the brakes of every bike. If you can imagine trying to do that for 500 brakes. But what you're also saying by doing so is you're saying that you are now deeming that bike to be safe and that those brakes are working. When in actual fact you can't possibly know how safe that bike is. And don't get me started by the different types of bikes you're going to see. At more serious events, the ITU does publish guidelines around what is an acceptable bike to go into transition area. And these rules are adopted from the UCI rules. For age group open events and fun events, these rules aren't strictly enforced.